I want to say this right now before anybody watches the video and gets mad about everything that I'm about to say. I have had genetic stripes for a very long time. I have thought the same thing that everybody thinks, but I have recently found out from my own breeding that it is incorrect. What's up, YouTube? So I don't know how many times I gotta say this. I think I've made 3 videos now on this exact same topic. Genetic stripes are not incomplete dominant. So thunderbolts are not super genetic stripes. And so there is 2 reasons. And these 2 reasons are not my reasons. These just 2 reasons are coming from the entire population of people breeding genetic stripes. And before I was like, well, so let's just go through the reasons. So the reasons why a super genetic stripe or a thunderbolt does not exist as a super genetic stripe, or is not the same as a super genetic stripe, is because 2 things. This is what I was told when I was breeding genetic stripes, and I'm still told today. In order to have a genetic stripe, or in order to call a stripe on a bearded dragon a genetic stripe, they have to be straight with no jagged edges and no breaks in the stripe. So with that said, genetic stripes, again, have to be perfectly straight, which I can agree with if we're all on the same page. Number 2, if you were to breed a thunderbolt to a dragon that has no stripes whatsoever, not a partial genetic stripe, not a broken genetic stripe, not a regular genetic stripe, not a straight genetic stripe, no stripe whatsoever, you will not get 100% stripes based off the definition of them all have to be perfectly straight, which is what I was told. So now let's get into the history of genetic stripes. So genetic stripes, when was the first time that I saw a genetic stripe? Genetic stripe, the first one that I saw, which they've been around for a long time because genetic stripe is polygenic. It was line bred, and the only way to produce it is by having at least one parent that has genetic stripes. Polygenic. Same thing with tiger bars. It's polygenic. So genetic stripes, I want to say the first one I saw was probably like 2014. The first one I owned was probably around the same time, actually, because I'm not the type to wait around. If I see something I like, I get it. So genetic stripe is not one of my top favorite morphs, but it is a very good accent morph. It adds to the bearded dragon. So if I were to have a leatherback dunner, that looks great. But if I had genetic stripe on top of it, it looks surreal. It looks amazing because genetic stripe now defines the back, keeps all of the dunner striping and everything else off to the side instead of it being everywhere. Because genetic stripe does give a definition to the spine, cleans up the spine. It creates a nice little area in the middle of the back where it's pretty perfect. So that's what I see in the genetic stripe anyways. Now, getting into genetic stripes back then, it wasn't as crazy as getting into genetic stripes now. Back then, people were fine with calling a dragon with broken stripes a genetic stripe. Nowadays, people aren't so keen to do that. People don't care if you call something a genetic stripe that is a broken stripe. They will automatically tell you that it's not a stripe. How do I know this? Because it happened to me. I want to say it was last year. I had bred my thunderbolts to Sarah, which was a hypo red het trans, no stripe whatsoever, normal stripe, normal scales, everything else was normal. And I bred them together and I got, I want to say maybe 40% of the dragons, 30 to 40% of the dragons were actual genetic stripes based off the definition that I have been given over and over and over again since that happened. So the newer breeders have decided that the definition for a genetic stripe is a perfect stripe down the back. 2 perfect racing stripes down the back, no break, no nothing in the stripes. That is the new definition for a genetic stripe. And I know this because whenever I was posting on Morph Market, They were taking my posts down, my listings down, because people were reporting them as false genetics or wrong genetics because of the genetic stripe being listed. So I always ask myself, should you just go with the flow and do what everybody else is telling you? Or should you do what you know is right? Because why not? Why would you do anything that's wrong? And I have talked to breeders that have been around for as long as I can remember. And they also are like, yeah, genetic stripe is polygenic, correct? But if you breed a Thunderbolt to a normal, you should get all genetic stripes. And I said, but listen to this. I said, but the new people are saying that the only way you can have a genetic stripe if the stripes are straight. And they're like, well, that's wrong, because then that would make the Thunderbolts not a super genetic stripe. And I said, there you go. Now you're on the same page. And they're like, so who are these new breeders? And I tell them, and they're like, oh, they're, nah. So, all right. Super genetic stripe technically does not exist. Super genetic stripe exists in the way that a polygenic trait would exist. If you have one parent with that trait, with that morph, all of the offsprings will exhibit a version of that morph because it's polygenic. So that means there's many different ways for that morph to express itself. Same thing goes for, you guessed it, genetic stripe. So genetic stripe has different ways of expressing itself, same as tiger. Tiger has different ways of expressing itself. There's tigers that are minimal tigers, and then there's extreme tigers. They're all over the place, but people still call them tigers. Why can't we do the same with genetic stripe? We don't go around calling extreme tigers super tigers. We don't go around saying that tigers are incomplete dominant. We know they're polygenic. Why can't we do the same thing with genetic stripe? Why is super genetic stripe even a thing? Why would we even go into calling it that? I'll tell you why. All right. So the first reason people call it a super genetic stripe is because it's an extreme version of genetic stripe. But that's not how that works. Polygenic traits don't have super morphs. Like, that's not a thing. So I don't want to get too into weeds because this is a history lesson, not a rant. But I told you guys I didn't want to really make a genetic stripe video because I know it's a touchy subject. And that's not only touchy for me, but it's touchy for everybody else right now breeding genetic stripes. So how do I do this without making everybody mad? Which I probably already did. Just already. Everybody's mad at me. So how do I do this? I'm just going to link the video of when I showed off all of my offsprings. I showed off the parents from this pairing that I keep talking about, because that's the only way I'm going to be able to tell anybody and persuade anybody of what I know. And that is that there is no such thing as super genetic stripe, because genetic stripe is polygenic. So when I say there's no such thing as super genetic stripe, people are going to say, well, there is, because if I breed a Thunderbolt to a genetic stripe, everything comes out genetic stripe. That is not how you get a super. That is the opposite of a super. A super of any morph, you take the parent that is a super, you breed it to a non of any of that morph, so it's not genetic stripe, and every single baby comes out genetic stripe. A super of an incomplete, so the scientific way of explaining this, a incomplete dominant morph is the same as a recessive morph. If you have one copy of a recessive morph, that dragon carries the morph. If you have two copies of the recessive morph, that dragon is visual for that morph. That is the same thing with super, except the heterozygous version, which is the carrying of the morph, is visual, so you can see it. However, the homozygous version of that morph, which is the super version, is also visual, but an extreme version of that morph. And the only way to produce heterozygous from a homozygous is by pairing the homozygous to a non-visual of that morph. So a super paired to a non of that morph, so no genetic stripe, will produce only heterozygous genetic stripe. And that means that everything will be genetic stripe. Same as if you were pairing a visual hypo to a non-hypo that is not het hypo, everything will come out 100% het hypo. The same way. That is how incomplete dominant works. And this is not a scientific video. I'm not trying to get into the weeds on that either, but that is just how incomplete dominant morphs work. And if we're saying that genetic stripe has different ways of expressing itself because it's polygenic, then it's not a super. And if we're also saying that genetic stripe only has one way of being expressed, then thunderbolts are not super genetic stripes, because again, go to the video, you'll see everything did not come out as genetic stripe. I showed that video to people that have been breeding for a long time, and based off the name polygenic, or based off the term polygenic, you can see all of those bearded dragons have a form of genetic stripe. At least 70% of those bearded dragons have a form of genetic stripe. The other 30%, you could still call them a genetic stripe, but it's not something that I would go around calling them a genetic stripe, because they are broken up enough to where it just looks like better stripes than usual, better, spinal stripes than usual. So it's not technically genetic stripe. So go to that video. And we got into that sometime last year, I can't remember, but it was just ever since then, I can't even talk about genetic stripe because people will get mad. Literally, people have blocked me all over social media because they think that I'm wrong about genetic stripes. I don't care. I could give a shit. But it is what it is. Genetic stripes are not incomplete dominant. They are polygenic. If you want to call a thunderbolt a super genetic stripe, then you have to be able to accept every single genetic stripe that comes out of that pairing. If you want to say that genetic stripes are only perfect stripes, then you cannot call a thunderbolt a super genetic stripe, because if you go back to the pairing, not everything came out with super straight stripes. I don't know how else to explain this, because it's honestly, this is such a draining topic to me, because I know I'm going to make somebody mad, and I don't care if I make people mad, but I know that it's just going to cause another line in the sand for people. And I'm not trying to divide the bearded dragon community. Honestly, if anything, I want to unite the bearded dragon community. I want to get us all on the same page. So I'm giving options. You either stop calling thunderbolts super genetic stripes, or you stop labeling or stop denying that other genetic stripes exist than just the super straight ones. So back then, people called everything a genetic stripe. People called everything a phantom stripe, even though phantom stripes only came from phantom dragons. People called everything a color stripe, because if it's there, it's there. Okay, so now people are just so picky, and I hate it. I hate it. Be more open to the idea of things. Stop saying there's only one way of doing things. Stop saying there's only one way of expressing that morph, because polygenic means there's different ways of expressing the morph. At least that's how I read into it. You can read what polygenic actually means, and it'll come out to almost the exact same way that I try to explain it, because it's hard to explain a scientific term to people that don't know the science behind it. So that's just the way I try to explain it in layman's terms. So that's it. That's all I got for you all. So hopefully I didn't make anybody mad. Hopefully everybody still appreciates everything that I said. If you made it this far into the video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss anything that I put out in the future. As always, peace.